After the mildly catastrophic bad trip through Woodstock, Imre and I decided that our next excursion should be something more relaxing and closer to his home turf. After all, we'd spent a lot of time on or near mine, in addition to that very disorienting tour of Latvia and Lithuania. Though he was born in Paris, Imre's primary residence is a ramshackle cottage in Normandy on a little plot of wooded land where his parents used to take him as a child. He moved there with his ex about 15 years ago, between the births of his 2 daughters. Eventually, the ex and the girls moved out to an apartment in the neighboring town. The girls still come and stay with him sometimes, but he's often there alone, if you can say alone about a place so teeming with flora and fauna. There are some trees that he planted there from tiny saplings that are now enormous. Over the years, he collected a small menagerie, including a ferret, rabbits, dogs, a tortoise, cats, and a variety of salamanders and birds. The plants also proliferated. Imre doesn't like an overly manicured lawn. When he travels, a neighbor comes by to feed the creatures. The flora are on their own. Imre seemed a little timid about having me stay at his place. I'm certainly no Eva Gabor, but it's true that my own natural habitat is on the urban end of the spectrum. He wondered how I'd take to his shack, but his dear friend and collaborator, the filmmaker Sandrine Vessé, offered us the beautiful country house that she shares with her partner, Ketal, and their son, Sandro. It was a short drive from Imre's, in Conchonouche. Sandrine and her family were going to be traveling. They asked if we could feed their chickens and cats, and said we'd be welcome to use the music studio in the attic. Ketal, like Sandrine, works in the film industry, but he's a great music enthusiast, and he plays the electric guitar. Ketal had also generously offered Imre access to his cellar full of snails. Imre seemed excited to be able to put me up in such palatial digs. Of course, I immediately wondered if I could get us a gig in the area. The internet provided exactly 0 information on live music venues in Conchonouche, but Ketal said that in fact there was one little restaurant in town with a terrace, and on occasion somebody played there. I was pretty sure we could worm our way in. When we got there, I saw the house was just as beautiful as I'd been told. Sandrine and Ketal's place is just around the corner from the town proper, behind a fence and down a sloping drive. It's very private, and though it's large, it feels very cozy, filled with Sandrine's own Matisse-like paintings, colored glass, flea market furniture, and Ketal's record collection. It's the kind of house that makes you feel immediately at ease. They'd given us our choice of rooms, but Imre thought the coziest was Sandro's, which had colorful walls that he'd scribbled on and some shelves stocked with model planes and board games. We gave the bed a test run. It did very nicely. After the test run, Imre jammed a little, naked, on the electric guitar. He seemed very relaxed. That week was heaven. Well, there was one small glitch, which I'll get to in a minute, but for the most part, we spent our mornings writing in bed and our afternoons canoodling in the sunshine. We had a lot of picnics involving wine and charcuterie. Imre insisted I should try andouille, a local specialty. It's a kind of cured meat with a very lacy, intricate pattern. That sounds delicate until you figure out that it's made of compressed pig intestines. It took me a while to understand that myself. When I asked Imre what it was made of, he said that his father's response to such queries about food was always, "C'est plein de bonnes choses." It's full of good things. He also made me try andouillette, a related sausage. As Wikipedia later informed me, true andouillette is rarely seen outside France and has a strong, distinctive odor related to its intestinal origins and components. The good news is that we ate it with some delicious purple beans that were growing in the garden. The kitchen was very rustic, with colored tiles on everything, and there was an open bird cage in the window, home to a semi-domesticated dove named Josephine who came and went at her leisure. In the evenings, we'd watch old films. Sandrine has an extensive collection of DVDs, and there were all kinds of books of cinematic history and criticism. There were a few films Imre was anxious to show me, including one he'd written for Sandrine about 15 years ago. It was an understated but devastating story of a young woman who's come unhinged. Imre's daughter Lucy had played this woman's daughter. Her performance was quiet, riveting, and utterly natural. Imre also wanted to show me some of his old favorite films, like the comical La Fiancée du Pirate by Nellie Kaplan. It was made in 1969, and it's about an ethical slut with great business sense living in the French boondocks. Imre seems to like women filmmakers, and though he doesn't arrange this on purpose, they're his most frequent collaborators. I don't think he wanted to turn me on to La Fiancée du Pirate because Nellie Kaplan was a woman, or even because I might vaguely resemble the central character in my history of erotic eclecticism. I think he just thought it was a remarkable film. It was. We made a couple of day trips. Imre took me to the Moulin d'Indé, an artist's colony where he sometimes goes to work. The Moulin became famous when Truffaut decided to film there. Parts of Jules and Jim were shot on the grounds, as well as the 400 Blows. It's the Seine that flows through the Moulin, though, of course, the river has an entirely different character there than it does in Paris. It's so bucolic. There's a small island in the middle inhabited by 2 old goats. I lay down by the bank of the river and listened to the birds and smelled the grass, and in seconds I was out cold. Imre waited patiently for me to wake up. While he watched me, he made up a song he called La sieste au bord de l'eau, a nap by the waterside. Later, Imre took me all the way to the coast, though I didn't fall asleep there. Oh, but before I get to that, I should really tell you about that glitch I mentioned, about our gig that didn't happen. Well, obviously we were feeling pretty lazy and relaxed in Conchonouche, so I hadn't even bothered to worry much about getting a booking at that restaurant that Ketal had mentioned. I figured we just had to walk in and announce ourselves as musicians, and they'd welcome us with open arms. So after a few days of picnicking, napping, and, as the song goes, strumming on the old banjo, Imre and I finally trekked up the hill into town, which is basically one street lined with picturesque 15th century half-timbered buildings. The ground floors are mostly occupied by small businesses, bakeries, knick-knack shops, barbers, and a real estate agency. Well, we paused in front of that one. There were several pictures of little bungalows in the area, some of which seemed unexpectedly affordable. We both stared at the pictures, and obviously we were fantasizing about having one of those for ourselves. I think I was the one who broke the silence. I said, "Imre, let's buy a house in the country." That surprised even me, not just because of the impracticality. Neither of us is what you'd call a person of means, but also because of that Green Acres discrepancy I mentioned before. Due to his sensitivity, his attachment to animals, and his need for cyclical patterns to appease his anxieties about the passage of time, Imre not only likes, but needs to spend a lot of time in nature. But I'm quite the city slicker. Still, there was obviously something about Normandy that was getting under my skin. He seemed to be deeply moved by the idea. Well, we continued traipsing at the hill, happy like that, holding hands and fantasizing about a common country life, when we suddenly found ourselves in front of the restaurant in question, an inviting little bistro called the Braderie Gourmande, which called itself not merely a restaurant, but also a lieu de vie, lounge, salon de thé, and cave à vin, with a panoramic view of the valley. Well, that sounded perfect until we saw it. The poster on the door, advertising a live performance that weekend by a blues duo going under the artistic moniker Lil Red and the Rooster. Doppelgangers. The spitting image of Imre Lodbrog et sa petite amie. Dead ringers. As the kids would say, what the fuck? Once we'd registered this blow, we rethought the cold call to the management. We decided to stroll around a bit more to regroup. Suddenly we began to notice the Lil Red publicity notice in the window of nearly every business establishment on the main drag. It was really weird. They'd practically wallpapered Conchonouche with the thing. We even retraced our steps to that real estate office and found it tucked in with some ads for yoga classes and a Neolithic art exhibit. Imre didn't seem particularly put out by this. If Lil Red and her purple rooster had beat us to the punch, she was happy enough to cede the gig to the competition. But being slightly more tactical about such things, I insisted on doing some internet reconnaissance when we got back to the house. It turns out Lil Red is a nice red-blooded American gal with Midwestern roots and what would appear, from photographic evidence, to be a taste for partying, while her sidekick, Pascal, is a native Normandy bluesman and a devotee of T-Bone Walker and Tiny Grimes. Don't laugh. Imre has a massive hard-on for Mississippi John Hurt. Well, go figure how that corn-fed Lil Red ended up with her Norman bluesman in Bernay, France. Did I mention I'm from Wisconsin? It was clear we'd been scooped. We threw in the towel and went to their show. There were some toe-tapping, white-haired patrons scattered around the terrace, enjoying, as we were, a glass of white wine. The view, as promised, was panoramic, and the band was entirely plausible. They had a pretty vast repertoire, mostly covers, but a few jaunty originals as well. Lil Red had pluck all right, and her rooster was brooding but supportive. Halfway through the show, a couple arrived, two very attractive paraplegics. He was wearing a leather jacket, and she had on heavy eye makeup. They were greeted warmly by the waitstaff. Evidently they were regulars, and space was made for their wheelchairs in an area with good lines of sight. They both lit up cigarettes and fondled each other throughout the show. It was very sexy, and I felt it gave me license to fondle Imre. So, oh well, no gig in Conche, but we spent quite a few happy hours going over our own repertoire in the attic studio, and also in a cozy corner of Sandrine and Ketal's dining room. We recorded our practice sets and called them the Normandy Sessions. Actually, we called them the legendary Normandy Sessions. And when you look at the footage we shot, indeed, I think we look pretty legendary. Somehow in Normandy it didn't matter if Imre was a legend in his own time or just in our own minds. At the end of the week, Sandrine and Ketal and Sandro came home, and we shared a meal of Ketal's famous escargot and some ceviche I'd prepared with Imre. We thanked them profusely and packed our gear into Imre's clunker. It was the moment of truth. We decided to spend the last few days at Imre's ramshackle hut. At this point, I was so stoned on nature I felt I could take anything. Well, of course, it wasn't nearly as derelict as he'd led me to believe. It was small and rustic, but thoroughly charming. He'd cleaned up a bit in anticipation of my visit, particularly the outhouse-like structure he calls his Capharnaum, a little studio where he writes and records most of his music. He'd actually taken a photo of it before the cleanup, conceding it was something of a natural disaster that deserved documentation. But even in its confused state, it had a Lodbrogish logic to it. The miscellany of modern and outmoded equipment, magical talismans, photos of himself and his kids, and above all, a cockamamie assortment of musical instruments made the perfect little protective layer for the production of what, over the last 15 years, had surely surpassed a couple of thousand songs. He'd thrown these on the heap of all the thousands that had come before, words and chords scribbled into notebook after coffee-soaked notebook. He shared some of those with me, along with a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1974, announcing his performance at a dîner spectacle. At the age of 22, the writer claimed, he had a repertoire of 350 songs. On the stage, the article continued, one would believe him to be in transit. Barely there, one senses he's already elsewhere, in a rush to escape the very public that both attracts and disturbs him. His photo appears to illustrate this elusive quality. When he was cleaning up the Capharnaum, Imre had unearthed some other remarkable things that he also showed me, at night, outside, under a flickering light. 2 wonderful scrapbooks he'd assembled from adventures he'd concocted with each of his sons, and 2 volumes of poetry by a young pianist he'd known in his early 20s, when he was studying at the École Normale de Musique. They'd had an intense but unconsummated romantic friendship, and after he'd left Paris, she took her own life, leaving him a letter absolving him of any responsibility but expressing her passion. Her mother had delivered this letter to Imre with tenderness and without a drop of blame. Still, the story haunted him. Over the years, he's lost several people this way. It seems he's drawn to very sensitive creatures, or perhaps they're drawn to him. Marie Isabel's poems were astonishing. They were bleak, but quick-witted, with some of the same insistent rhyme schemes and wordplay that mark Imre's songwriting. Occasionally I thought I might have caught an oblique reference to him, a street name, a green eye. The scrapbooks were also very touching. Imre told me that one year, lacking funds to take him on a proper trip, Imre had proposed to his older son, Tom, that they spend 1 week in the woods with only a few supplies, some water, butane, cooking oil, a bag of lentils, and hunt and forage for their survival. Imre had documented each meal with a fancy description of what they'd prepared, plenty of dandelion salad and ragout of mushrooms, and photographs of Tom eating, evidently ravenously. There were also a few small birds they'd caught in traps, and on one occasion, a pheasant. The trip with Martin, his younger son, involved a week-long hike with a very recalcitrant donkey named Henri Pissenlit. Henri nearly drove them crazy, but they ended up quite attached and cried at their parting. The last full day of my stay, Imre drove me up the coast to the uncanny cliffs of Varengeville. It's like another planet. The immense, dark cliffs are in a constant, slow state of decomposition, first falling off as boulders, then breaking down into stones, and finally disintegrating into particles of sand. Imre had shown me a passage from a novel he'd written, in which an old man stands on the cliff and contemplates this stony degeneration, the mixed-in bones of suicides, of unfortunate drunks who might have come to the edge for a last piss, glissés, trébuchés, basculés dans un cri, avalés par le vide, écrabouillés en bas. Slipping, stumbling, toppling over with a cry, swallowed by the vacuum, crushed below. The old man surveys the scene and, I quote, "In his noggin, this is the great confusion of space and time." The weird, crumbling seascape seems to him le plus lointain des pays, the most distant of all countries, his own lost youth. The novel was never published, but Sandrine made the story into a film. The story, in brief, is about the encounter between a young boy and the old man he will become.
Qui êtes-vous?
Toi.
Needless to say, the child's terror and wonder at the passage of time is also Imre's. From the outset, his life was marked by a debilitating anxiety about the passing of the minutes, hours, days, years. Imre needs the grass, weeds, and trees, the cliffs, rocks, and sand to make sense of all this. Still, the passing of time sometimes keeps him up at night. The next morning he drove me back to the airport for my flight back to New York. We'd had excellent luck with the weather during my stay, but that morning there was a deluge. It was coming down so hard the wipers were entirely useless. We had to pull over for a while, and as though emulating the raindrops, tears also fell from Imre's eyes. He was sad the Normandy Sessions were ending, and so was I, but he was also feeling that bigger sadness, the one about time passing. Why am I more placid about that? It's not that I care less. I just don't seem to hear the clock ticking. I mean, I know it is, and of course sometimes I'm struck by how quickly my own 5 decades have passed, but I have the impression there's still plenty of time left for both of us. I even wrote a lullaby to remind Imre of that when he gets overwrought about time. I did the math and gave him a rough estimate of what I thought was a reasonable accounting. If you're worried and you can't sleep, close your eyes and just dream.